Welcome to the Golf Fitness Bomb Squad. My name is Chris Finn. I'm your host, and today I want to talk about a story that was actually just from a conversation with a client. And I wanted to share with you kind of the journey, the story. I think it's going to relate to a lot of you listening, just because literally is like a story I've heard, I don't know, hundred times. And so it's a guy who he's 65. He's got documented arthritis in his trail hip, a little bit in his lead hip as well. He's a right-handed player, so it's his right hip and his left hip. So right hip is his trail side, left hip is his lead side. If you're lefty, just reverse that, obviously. But basically, we know he has arthritis. He's 65, and one of the big things he came to us with is, he's trying to, obviously improve his golf game. Number one thing though was just to feel better. He had some back pain, some hip pain stuff. So basically, he came to us. He had like 5 degrees of hip rotation on both sides. He's probably, I guess it's been a year. It's gone up 400%. So he's at like 20, 25 degrees in his trail side, about 30 degrees in his lead side. So it's still, ideally we want to get those in the like around 40 degrees. But when you do have arthritis, 20 may be your 40. And I wanted to highlight that today because in a lot of cases, it ends up being true, right? So in an ideal world, yeah, we get both hips to 40, 45 degrees of internal rotation. People can make a full turn to their takeaway, a full turn, through the ball. They can clear their hips. They have great kinematic sequence. Their ground force sequences are great and in the right ratios. But if you have arthritis in your hips, and this is true if you have it in your shoulders as well, there likely will be a point where it's as good as it's going to get, unless you have a joint replacement, right? Like what you got is what you got. There's bony block. You can't push through the brick wall, right? Like it's going to be there. And so I think if that is you, then, and this process is actually the same for anybody, but it's, I just want to highlight it in specific fashion for those of you who do have arthritis in the hips or shoulders. It's basically as you get to that point where you're like, and this is where, our physios, we'll assess like, okay, yep, there's at the end of a range of motion, there's a soft block or end feel, and there's a hard end feel. A hard end feels like, basically think of like if you open up your door and it like hits the wall, like it's not going to go any further, like, right, like that's hard, versus if you like have somebody who's like when I go home, my 12-year-old will try to like keep the door shut, like as I'm trying to open it, they're trying to push it to keep it closed, and I'm obviously stronger, so I can kind of slowly push it through, right? That's a soft end feel. There's some resistance, but I can keep going. It's not hitting a hard stop like it would like a door and hitting a wall, right? And so I think that's the difference that we look for, is when we get to that 20 degrees, is it a hard end feel, or is my 12-year-old just trying to keep the door closed and I can kind of push through it, right? And that's what happens when your tissue's just tight and you need to open up and go through it. So I think that's the first thing we look for. But at some point, let's say he's stuck at 20 degrees as good as he's going to get. Now, that's still from 5 to 20 is a 400% increase. That's freaking awesome, right? But it's still halfway where we'd want to be. And if we look at most tour guys, they're getting 30 to 35 degrees into that trail side. So we're still 10 to 15 degrees short. So what do we do with that? And I think luckily for this gentleman, while his right hip is not great, he has a really good right shoulder, and his left hip is actually not too bad. So what we're going to look to do is optimize as much as we can his right shoulder, because that'll help with his turn on his takeaway to make up for the lack of the trail hip. And we're going to try to optimize his thoracic spine, right? That's the bones, basically your spine between your collarbone and your belly button. That's where a lot of your rotation comes from. We want to optimize that to get as much turn as we can to help overcome what the hip is not giving him, right? So, and then obviously the left side, we want to get as much rotation as we can to that lead side to help through impact. And so basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to counteract the limitation we know we have that we can't improve, right? It's as good as it's going to get. But then the cool thing is then you can look at working with a golf professional. When we do a lot of these kind of consultations with pros all the time, we'll say, hey, we got, let's call him Paul, right? We have Paul, and his right hip only goes 20 degrees. And we say, and you want him to get a deeper turn because you're saying that's what's going to help him, in his golf swing for some reason. Well, there's some solutions that we can implement there, right? We can drop his trail foot a little deeper. We can point his toes out a little bit to give him a little bit more room to get into that trail side, right? So figure if instead of standing with your toes straight forward, and now he's only got 20 degrees to get into his right hip, if we flare it 10 degrees, well, now he can still only turn 20, but it'll be the equivalent as if he went 30, right? Now that does come with performance variance potentially that you got to get used to. And that's why having the instructor there, somebody who can help them understand how to manage club face, relationship to path and all those sorts of things that will change if we move, foot position. But that's an important part if we're looking at playing this game for a really long time. There's no pain, it's just arthritic. There's no need to get a hip replacement. So we need to come up with conservative options for them to basically work around it, if that makes sense. So hopefully, I mean, it's not a complex conversation, but I think it's an important one. And like I said, it's a relatively simple conversation, I guess, but it's not necessarily easy. Maybe that's the best way to describe it. And that the first step for any of you guys out there, are girls. I mean, typically guys, you guys end up having it worse, but women obviously get arthritis too. If anybody is dealing with arthritis, particularly in the hips or the shoulders, those are the two big rotary joints where we'll see it. The number one thing is let's see how far can you get. Like, just because you have arthritis doesn't mean you can't get any better, right? They're like this guy went, literally 400% better, but arthritis stopped him, from basically halfway from where ideally we'd like him to be. So the step one is get as far as you can. Step two is understand when you're at your limit. Don't keep trying to push through. You're just going to piss your joint off. And then step three is then, all right, now let's work through some solutions and some modifications that we can make in the actual golf swing to accommodate what your body can and cannot do. And I think when you can combine all of that together, you have a really nice recipe for longevity in the game. You have a really nice recipe for just health in general. And I think it's also in a way empowering that, hey, as long as I keep it to 20 degrees, that's as good as it's going to get. That's where I need to keep it. And as long as I can learn to play with that, we're going to be good. Right. So hopefully you guys found that helpful. Like I said, this goes for shoulders, hips, those either joints. And obviously the conversation's maybe a little different if it's your lead hip or your trail hip. Your trail hip, obviously you need more rotation. So if you only have 20 degrees on your trail hip, less impactful than if you only have 20 degrees on your lead hip. That will be more impactful because you need to really clear through. That's going to really impact your ability to clear through the ball. So net, I guess I would say, if you are going to get arthritis and a genie came to you and said, which hip would you like it in? Ask for it in the trail hip. And if he said you're going to get shoulder arthritis, ask for it in your lead shoulder, right? Those are the two that are least impactful from a golfing perspective. And if that's resonates with you, then that's great. You have your lead hip and your trail shoulder to kind of make up for that. If unfortunately you're somebody who's got the issues in the shoulder and the hip that are most important, the lead hip and the trail shoulder, well, then that just means we're going to have to come up with some modifications earlier. But doesn't mean you can't play the game of golf. Doesn't mean you can't play it well. And most importantly, it doesn't mean you have to stop enjoying the game that we love. So hopefully that diffused a few myths around arthritis and that you're stuck, you're screwed, you can't do anything about it. And hopefully that also educates people in terms of the difference of knowing when you're as good as you can get, right? You can get better, but you likely will not get all the way to what a quote unquote normal hip would get to, or what a hip replacement would get to. But hopefully that helps you guys out, and hopefully learned a few things. And if you're curious where you stand, obviously we always have the home assessment in the in the show notes and links. It's free. Go take it. You can kind of see how good the hip is, how good the shoulder is, and that's a great starting point for you to know where you're at. So thanks as always. Catch you on the next episode.